This is Aegis, and for the last 2 years, I've been filling it with stories of industrial mechs, intrepid robots, pirate spacecraft, flora, fauna, and lots of walkers. But today, I'll be trying something brand new, traveling from the great Aegean Sea of the last build to create my very first aircraft. I'll take you from original concept to kitbash to painting to short story, so buckle up. This is Gamey Builds, and welcome to Beyond the Blight. A few months ago, I purchased a huge lot of model aircraft from eBay for about $50. I love these grab bags, which provide plenty of surprises and serve as endless inspiration fodder. This early in a project, however, I'm really just looking for bits that catch my eye. Interesting shapes and textures help me develop a visual language for the build. Taping pieces together helped me get a more concrete feel for the finished model. Masking tape worked just fine for most of this, but tacky putty lended a helping hand here and there. Basically, this is sketching in 3D, and it's extremely helpful in creating a physical rough draft. As I've said before, perspective drawing is always a significant challenge for me. It took many tries to get these wings looking right, and while I wasn't totally happy with the end result, just as I wasn't really happy with the pilot's outfit and helmet, which looked like a throwaway Star Wars concept, it was way too early in the project to get hung up on details. So I decided to let the ideas marinate and attack these problems later during the build phase. Once the pencil sketch was in the bag, I outlined everything with ink pens, then finished with my usual watercolors. Over the last few months, I've gotten quite a few requests to sell prints of these original watercolor concepts, so I'm happy to announce that I've created a small batch of prints of a select number of designs. I've also stuck a few of the mecha concepts on my first ever sticker sheet, and you can check all this stuff out along with my other merch at gameybuilds.com. Unlike many other shops here on YouTube, I personally fulfill and ship each of the orders you place from the same tiny apartment workshop where the builds happen. While I'm limited on space, if there's something you'd love to see added to the store, don't hesitate to let me know in the comments. It's not often that I get to actually build a model the way it was intended, so it was kind of refreshing to assemble this engine block, attach it to the fuselage, then glue the other half of the hull into place. The quality of the injection molding here was pretty unimpressive, so I had to fill a lot of the gaps with baking soda and then sand it down for an even finish. The top and bottom halves of the wings were attached next, and after everything was sanded, I dry fitted them to the body and began modifying the fuselage, first removing this tail section, then adding some more internal components. A new tail rudder was attached with green stuff, which in this case was preferable to superglue as it could be adjusted slightly as it dried. A keel stabilizer was also added using the same method, and finally some horizontal stabilizers. The wings could finally be glued on, and then it was on to sealing these awful gaps with epoxy sculpt and water. Other finer gaps were filled in with modeling putty, then sanded. Next came the wing flaps. Now, on a typical aircraft, these flaps are just small levered extensions on the wings, which provide more than enough maneuverability to the craft, even on something like an F-16 jet. It doesn't really make sense that these flaps would need to be this large, but, well, welcome to sci-fi. In fact, if you wanted to graph designs from science fiction, you could place them on a chart like this, with one axis representing sensibility and the other representing aesthetics, or how cool it is. I actually spend a lot of time thinking about my designs in this context, striving to land somewhere to the middle right of this graph, and succeeding sometimes. For me, one of the purposes of detailing is to cover up some of the seams and gaps from the previous step. Sometimes that's just a matter of attaching an approximately sized piece with superglue, but other times it means filling in with green stuff or epoxy sculpt, then smoothing out the excess putty. This is also the point where the final build tends to deviate from the concept, as I stumble across combinations of pieces that are frankly a lot more interesting than the original artwork concept. The wing flaps required the most drastic modifications, as I needed to attach the hardware for the pneumatic arms. A drill press would make this so much easier, but in the meantime I had to slowly work my way up to larger and larger bits until eventually the pieces could be inserted. My process for building these models and dioramas is constantly evolving, and I'm always on the lookout for new tools to help streamline the process. One of the best free tools I've recently come across to do this is Milanote, an easy-to-use website and app to organize ideas and creative projects into visual boards. It was especially helpful in organizing reference photos, which in this case were old World War II bombers, along with a ton of rust, grime, and pipe photos which would come in handy during the painting stage. All of these images were then linked to several to-do lists which outlined each step of the build process, making it very easy to track my progress. I also love the export to PNG and PDF features, which allowed me to make this whole thing into a physical printout to pin to my workspace. And if this had been a collab, sharing the board with others to plan and brainstorm was an option too. Milanote is available for free with no time limit. Sign up using the link in the description and start your next creative project. Now at this point in the detailing, with the main shapes locked in and the imperfections of the base model concealed, it feels a lot like solving a jigsaw puzzle. I'm looking for pieces that fit physically while also suiting the visual language and suggesting some sort of mechanical use. I also had a lot of fun with the piping here, which was a key element from the original concept. This piping was made from the internal wires of an old USB cable and was really convincing at this scale. To match the style of the recessed circular hardware on the wing flaps, I drilled holes into the wing tips and added wheel bits, then inserted the ends of the piping. Once all the wires were carefully glued down to the underside, along with these bits here, I began building out the thrusters that sit on the back of the craft, inspired by the engines of Gulfstream jets. I cut these pegs from a set of Gundam hips, attached them to this Gundam thigh, made some alterations, filled some gaps, then glued everything to the fuselage before attaching these thigh bits and gluing. Some panels were added here for detail, and then I attached the main thruster. Ribbed cables have always been a big part of my builds. In the old days, I would make them from actual wound bits of wire. But when textured with these ribbed molds, epoxy putty makes much more convincing cables that can be easily formed to perfectly fit any contour. If you've got a 3D printer and would like to make this mold yourself, I've got a free download available on my website. I next wanted to add some brackets that would hold the piping in place. They were way too small to be 3D printed, so I instead opted for these hollow Q-tip rods, which were sliced and halved, then carefully set in place with white glue. I should have used superglue instead though, as many of these pieces later fell off and needed to be superglued anyway. Finally, to create the fin struts, I marked out the general shape on some chipboard, taped down a 2mm acrylic rod, then used my heat gun to soften and bend the plastic. After making 2 of these and trimming them down, I sanded them up a bit to make the priming coat of paint adhere, since this would be really tricky to do after assembly. I then glued the rods onto the hull with Gorilla Glue, keeping everything in place with alligator clips until the glue dried. Q-tip rods added extra support for the struts, and the fins were finally glued in place. However, this design looked really goofy to me, I kept thinking of a jumping frog or a flying squirrel, and since whimsy wasn't the goal here, I snapped them off and opted for an inside placement, which looked much better. I finished up the underside with some more hardware and a few other odds and ends. After my last build, I was not in the mood to completely design an original character. So I decided to search for downloadable pilot STL files. I settled on this World War II pilot from Efran because it was the approximate position I needed, and I liked the more retro design of the uniform. The pose wasn't perfect though, so I spent a good bit of time creating an armature, labeling all the limbs, and then linking the corresponding parts of the pilot mesh. This would allow for some very precise posing later. For the aircraft's controls, I grabbed a free motorcycle STL on Thingiverse, then removed everything but the seat, tanks, and handlebars. I swapped out the handlebars for a yoke, added the necessary hardware for it to make sense, then carefully posed each of the pilot's limbs for a natural fit. A seat was added, and I learned how to make upholstery to give our daring pilot just a tiny bit more comfort, since, he doesn't have a windshield. Next were some pedal controls stuck to each foot. Using some of the existing meshes, I then created the hardware to attach all of the loose pieces. And this was the result. The really tricky bit here was getting this to attach to the hull, but I settled on simply sanding the center of the fuselage down, filling the exposed hole with aluminum foil and epoxy sculpt, then sticking the pilot down. Sometimes, the easiest solutions really are the best. For the base, I went with a 4x4-inch pine box, purchased as usual from the dollar store. After sanding the surfaces, I glued down some 1-inch XPS foam, then trimmed the excess with a foam cutter. Since I wanted this scene to be taking place on a hill, I carved away a slope into the foam, then roughed up the surface with a wire brush so that whatever went down after this would stick to the foam. I next created some texture paste with plaster of Paris, paper from my shredder, water, and a bit of sand-colored paint. This was lathered on, and while that dried, I mixed up another batch of plaster, this time adding some Mod Podge before pouring it onto some wax paper. I did this a few times, changing the color with each batch. When it dried, the result was a layer of hard plaster in various colors that could easily be broken up into flat rocks and gravel. I added a hole and an acrylic rod, then a layer of white glue and isopropyl alcohol, then sprinkled on the plaster rocks. With everything built, it was on to painting, and of course, the short story. The yellow cloud lifted like a stage curtain, revealing the sweeping hills of shale, the dust clouds wafting up from the valley, and above, a sliver of moon that hung like a dagger over the bleeding planet. "Good plume," cracked the voice of a female pilot in his headset. She sounded so far away, though she couldn't be more than 10 kilometers to the south. "You laid your gas trail right over the main fungal colony. I must have done this before, huh?" she asked, and the pilot felt proud. He couldn't remember being complimented by a crewmate before, although these days, he couldn't remember much. These days, it was as if every moment was spent strapped into his bomber, feeling its heat radiate up through his boots, hearing the eternal thump and clatter of its thruster engines, and watching the ground below as he soared over the fungal perimeter. But he supposed the gaps in his memory was really just the blight. It had a way of seeping into the mind, he thought, just as it seeped into groundwater and root systems, poisoning cities from the inside out. Maybe he was being poisoned this way, one breath at a time, a touch of forgetfulness here, a bit of madness there, until... "Thank you. I don't believe I got your name, pilot," he said awkwardly. He craned his neck to scan the skies around him, but if anyone else was riding this horizon, they had to be scoping the valleys or surfing canyons. His was the only craft he could see. Rai Jalid," said the voice, and the pilot's headset twittered as a blurb of text and images flittered into his peripheral. She was young, pretty. Vibrant red hair set against her dark blue uniform. But her eyes, they appeared blank, as if her face had been drawn in by an artist who hadn't bothered painting them. "You can ask, you know," Rai said. "It's the first thing anyone on here wants to know when they see my profile, though few have the gall to bring it up. Premature macular degeneration. Pretty common where I am. They say it's the groundwater down here." "You're blind," said the pilot, flicking off the bomber's thrusters and letting it glide on a wind current. "Indeed. But you're a pilot," she laughed. "Also common where I'm from. You've heard of cave racing?" "No." "Popular sport in this district. Kids race through the cave tunnels on scrap-built repulsor craft. You know, ugly old things welded together from when the Empire still ran factories and junkyards in the north. You'd be surprised how many repulsor units they left behind. Worth a fortune now, but there's no way to get them to the surface. Anyway, about half the kids that run the caves have one form of visual impairment or another, but they've overcome them by relying on their ears. We install these chatterboxes and chirpers on our racers. With practice, your brain begins to translate the echoes into a kind of mental map." "Like echo probes," the pilot said, amazed. "Yep. Some say that's where the first racers got the idea, but I think it was the other way around. Empire's always taking." "And that's how you're flying now? By sound? But we're out in the open. There's no echoes." "That is thanks to an add-on for my piloting console, a tactile deck. All visual data is translated into a bump map and carried via microfluid through my desk. I can literally feel everything you see. The hills, the stones, that old dried-out riverbed to your left." The pilot turned to look. "And you, of course." "Amazing," he said into his headset, in a voice just above a whisper. "What's real amazing is that we can interact like this from so far away. I mean, for me it's just touch and sound, but those who've seen the realm with their own eyes are just blown away by the realism. And frankly, I'm amazed by you." Beneath his headset, the pilot frowned. There was an odd sensation in the center of his head. Not quite pain, but pressure. Yes, that was it. A pressure, like an expanding balloon. Maybe a balloon filling with poison gas. "What do you mean?" the pilot stammered. "Where are you? I can't see you." "Well, I already told you. I'm logged on from a remote console." "But where's your aircraft? If you're piloting a drone bomber, why can't I see it?" The balloon was larger now, pressing against the walls of his mind. "There is no aircraft, of course. I'm just observing. This is just a tutorial. I can't fly until I finish watching you do it. What I wasn't expecting was this level of interaction. You really do feel real." They weren't lying about that. And there in the background, swimming around the woman's voice, were the sounds of other voices, of men and women, boys and girls, talking excitedly, joking. These were not soldiers. "Real?" the pilot asked. The pressure was unbearable now. "Sure, one of the projections designed to guide players through the simulation. Every conversation you've had with my friends was completely unique. You're very convincing. I can't wait to fly with you in the real game." The pilot reached for words out of his grasp as the girl 10,000 kilometers away and deep underground peeled the headset from her ears, handed them to the next player, and pressed the reset button. And the silver dagger moon rose, and the hills and valleys of shale faded, and the yellow curtain of gas descended once again. Thank you all so much for watching. I know that many of you are eagerly awaiting the novel, and while I don't yet have a release date for you, I've just launched this page on my website, where you can apply to be one of my test readers. I'm looking for just a handful of editors with varied backgrounds, so if that interests you, please visit gameybuilds.com. Until next time, this is Gamey Builds, over and out.